Now, one of the hottest talking points from Singapore so far was the TD018 and the poor performance of Red Bull. And while many believe that this was just a track-specific deficit for the most dominant car on the grid, others have related it to the newest technical regulation that's taken a specific dig at what the RB19 does best: flexes without triggering porpoising. However, with Red Bull adamant that they'll be back to the Max show in Suzuka, is this really a clampdown on the most dominant team and a desperate cry for competition before 2026? Or have we been shown false hope for just one race? If there is one thing that not just F1 fans, but the FIA and Liberty Media would kill to do right now, is to have more competition up front. And since that cannot be done overnight, there are certain ways in which the rivals can catch up with the extraordinary fast RB19. So far, it seems like they're waiting on the FIA and its technical regulations to be modified and pushed more towards their way, which includes an increased ride height that comes along with reduced downforce and increased drag, and that in itself is a bad picture for the sport. But what can we do when nobody came close to fighting with the mighty RB19 up until Singapore, where a seemingly hurtless TD018 was introduced, and all of a sudden, on a pure pace deficit, both RB19s were out of Q3 and out of the podium. Yes, you heard that right. If you missed the race, you would be amazed to hear that Verstappen and Perez started P11 and P13 and were out qualified by both Haas drivers and Liam Lawson, who was in his third race of his career. It's a pretty low result if you consider the fact that they were holding all but 2 pole positions this year, the one in Baku that was won by Leclerc and the one in Budapest that was won by Verstappen. But Singapore provided a different challenge for Red Bull, one in which they had no idea they would struggle as much as they did, and the Friday practice sessions have actually shown where the car's performance window is, way outside its peak performance. Even though Newey and Horner are adamant that the poor performance was mostly due to a setup change and has nothing to do with the regulation, simply because the regulation didn't ask them to change a specific part on their car, changing the setup so that you'll comply with the plank wear does seem like a regular shot at your dominance, and tracks like Singapore have lots of bumps and curbs and tend to wear down the planks a lot if the car is ridden very low to the ground, will be massive challenges for the RB19 in the future. So what is the TD018 we're constantly mentioning in this video anyway? This is just a small addition to all of the technical regulations regarding the flexing of the wings or some particular parts of them. And in this specific situation, the TD018 was meant to put a stamp on the flexible aerodynamic bodywork, amid concerns that some teams may have been bending the rules in the past couple of years. One very similar move was done last year during the summer break, but considering the fact that the main perpetrators, Red Bull and Ferrari, were not hurt by it, the impression that this was just a poor sportsman show from Mercedes in a bid to try and slow down their rivals by involving the FIA was obtained by the general F1 audience. Now, however, Ferrari has been brilliant, just like they normally do on high downforce tracks like Singapore, but Red Bull was nowhere to be found, mainly thanks to 2 huge reasons: rear instability and upshift issues, with the former actually coming from the latter. It might sound complex, but it's not, because in order for you to understand this entire concept, you need to look at the braking zones from Red Bull and Ferrari in 3 of the most high demanding corners on the track, turns 1, 9 and 10. The RB19 brakes a lot earlier and for quite a longer period of time, which then results in them sacrificing a lot of entry speed and exiting the corner a lot slower, to the point of them not actually being able to make it to Q3. Now, the internet isn't quite convinced that the TD018 didn't actually have to do something with the Red Bull's lack of performance, simply because this isn't 2022 when Verstappen's tactical entrance into the pit lane before finishing his fast lap caused him to start P15. This was a genuine lack of pace. Yes, it's a setup that caused all of it, but had it not been for the TD018, then Red Bull would have easily complied with the rules and their plank wear would have been normal. And in this entire situation, there is one thing that you need to remember. Red Bull are the only team that's capable of driving the car so low to the ground without triggering porpoising. This has been sacrificed by all of their rivals thanks to them raising the ride height and building proper setups around it. So when Red Bull was actually forced to raise the ride height for the first time in the 2023 season, it caught the aerodynamicists off guard, and that caused the two massive issues that I mentioned earlier in this video: rear instability and upshift issues. The upshift issues were mostly caused by the gear shift strategy that was induced by the torque transfer being too abrupt while upshifting and downshifting. And while it did help with the slow speed corners that require a lot of downforce because it avoided the RPM drop, it created rear instability and the feeling like the RB19 is driving on ice. This ultimately meant that Verstappen and Perez must slightly reduce the speed when changing the gear, or at least trim the setup differently, which then again presented an off-guard challenge for the aerodynamicists because they had no idea that the clampdown of these particular parts being flexed would have such an impact on the RB19. Again, Horner feels like Suzuka would be a max show yet again, and this was just a one-race shrug-off that needs to be forgotten as soon as possible. And like Newey said, everything that could have gone wrong did in the matter of a couple of days. Nonetheless, is this really something that should worry Red Bull for the future? And did the FIA actually find a way to make the season more interesting and create a valid championship opportunity from 2024 onwards? Well, according to Toto Wolff, who was a huge skeptic about the TD018 before it was implemented regarding slowing down Red Bull, it's way too early to determine whether it's done its part in equalizing the grid and making Red Bull more vulnerable. Mostly because they've already given up on developing the 2023 car, and we have no idea what's in the works for 2024. When talking about this matter, the Austrian went on to say, "It's so difficult. We have one set of data now, Friday and Saturday in Singapore. Tomorrow is the race, and then we're going to move it to a different track where that plays a role. So let's wait. We've seen those one-offs with Mercedes in the past, and that's why I'd rather now concentrate on what we can deliver on Sunday than think too much about whether that could have an effect yet." Yes, Suzuka is a vastly different track compared to Singapore when it comes to its downforce requirements, and while it's still narrow and offers small opportunities for overtaking, it's still something that can and will take a toll on Red Bull's flexibility. One thing is for sure, the FIA found Red Bull's painful spot, and they're very likely to utilize it the best that they can, because if they cannot bring the other teams to build cars that can run low to the ground without triggering porpoising, they might as well push Red Bull to raise their ride height and hope that it will make the competition more equal, something that the sport desperately needs after all the Mercedes dominance from 2014 to 2020. Christian Horner spoke about the car that they have brought to Singapore and insisted it was basically the same one as in Monza and Zandvoort. Therefore, there is no need to panic. But in such a tightly regulated era, with both technical and financial regulations bottlenecking every move of the F1 teams, it seems almost impossible to actually invent something new that would create an even greater gap. A move that Red Bull didn't actually need, but now might be forced to thanks to the added TD018. When asked about whether the new technical regulation had any implications for how the car performed during the entire weekend, Horner went on to add, "Zero implications, nothing has changed on the car. We tried a new aero part on Friday and we reverted on that component, so it's a tried and tested setup that we have. It just hasn't responded on this circuit, on this asphalt. Trying to get the tyres to get into the window, it's been very hard for both drivers." Well, I guess we can call it a bad weekend. Every team is allowed to have at least one, especially if you're on Red Bull's spot, and the fact that Verstappen's second stint with the medium tyres was practically one of the best ones on the grid goes to show that this might not be that big of an issue after all. However, it's a positive sign that things are bound to change in the foreseeable future, and for the first time ever, we might not have to wait until 2026, or as the FIA feared, 2029, to see a new champion other than Verstappen or Red Bull.